He was a billionaire who had given his son everything except the chance to feel normal again. One night, he caught the maid doing something no one in his world dared to try, giving his disabled boy back his stolen joy. But what he did next shocked everyone and changed their lives forever. Before we dive into this unforgettable journey, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? If stories about love, sacrifice, and second chances speak to your heart, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we're bringing you another powerful story you won't want to miss. The Hale estate loomed over the city like a fortress of glass and stone, its sharp lines cutting into the skyline as though daring anyone to approach. From the outside, it was a picture of perfection, the sort of mansion whispered about in business magazines and envied by competitors. Yet for all its grandeur, within its endless halls and polished marble floors, silence reigned like an unbroken curse. The place felt less like a home and more like a monument, cold, immaculate, untouchable. At the center of it all lived Victor Hale, the man who built this empire with his unrelenting will. Known in the corporate world for his ruthlessness, he was feared as much as he was respected. Competitors described him as a predator, one who struck without hesitation. He carried himself like a man who had everything: power, wealth, and influence beyond imagination. But what no magazine cover showed was the emptiness that trailed him like a shadow. Since the death of his wife in a tragic accident, Victor's heart had hardened into stone. Love and tenderness had no place in his vocabulary anymore, only control, strategy, and survival. For his son Adrian, the mansion was not a playground, but a prison. The boy had been just 6 years old when the car accident robbed him of both his mother and the use of his legs. Now 10, Adrian sat quietly in his wheelchair, his dark hair often falling into his eyes as he withdrew from the world around him. He was sharp, bright even, but he rarely spoke. When he did, his voice carried hesitation, as though every word risked rejection. Surrounded by opulence, Adrian felt only the sting of isolation, as though the walls themselves reminded him daily of what he had lost. The staff moved efficiently through the mansion, polished uniforms and strict routines defining their every step. Yet despite their presence, Adrian may as well have been invisible. They did their jobs, they followed orders, but few dared to look at him with anything more than perfunctory politeness. To them, he was the billionaire's disabled son, someone fragile and untouchable, defined more by tragedy than by who he really was. And so the boy learned to keep his silence, burying his dreams beneath layers of loneliness. Then came Sofia Ramirez. She arrived quietly, with no fanfare, just another maid in a household of many. Unlike the others, she didn't come from elite agencies or carry letters of recommendation stamped with noble seals. She was young, humble, and almost painfully unassuming. With her dark eyes that carried both warmth and wariness, and her hands roughened by years of labor, she was far from the polished perfection Victor's staff normally embodied. Yet she slipped into the routine with quiet efficiency, cleaning corners no one else bothered with, organizing rooms with a diligence that went unnoticed by those too busy to care. But what set her apart was not how she cleaned the marble floors or polished silver, it was how she looked at Adrian. The first time she saw him was in the sunroom, where the boy sat staring out at the gardens beyond the glass walls. Most staff passed him by with a nod, but Sofia paused. Something about the curve of his shoulders, the way his fingers fidgeted with the wheel of his chair, made her heart ache. He didn't look like the master's son, heir to untold billions. He looked like a child longing to be seen. "Beautiful garden," Sofia said softly as she passed, dusting a table nearby. Adrian blinked, surprised by the voice. He didn't answer at first, expecting her to leave it at that. But when he glanced sideways, he saw her smile, not one of pity, but something different. Gentle, human. "You must like sitting here," she added, her tone casual, as though speaking to any other boy. Adrian hesitated, then nodded. It wasn't much, but it was more than he had given anyone in weeks. From that day, Sofia found small ways to draw him out. She didn't force conversation, but when she noticed one of his toy cars lying broken on the carpet, she crouched down beside him. "Little guy's wheel popped off," she murmured, examining it carefully. "Do you mind if I try fixing it?" Adrian's eyes widened. No one had bothered with his toys in years, not since his mother. The staff saw them as clutter, relics of a boy who needed to grow up. But Sofia treated the toy with the seriousness of a surgeon. She fetched a small screwdriver, adjusted the axle, and with a triumphant grin, handed it back. Corton sighed. Good as new. Adrian's lips twitched into something that looked almost like a smile. As the days passed, Sophia's presence became a quiet thread in Adrian's life. At breakfast, when the staff set his plate before him and left, she lingered just long enough to sit across from him while she polished the silverware. She asked him about the things no one else did, whether he liked the food, if he had a favorite book, what color he thought the sunrise was that morning. They weren't grand conversations, but they were conversations, and slowly, Adrian began to answer in more than just nods. Blue, he whispered once, when she asked about the sky. It looked like blue fire. Sophia's eyes softened. That's a beautiful way to say it. For the first time in years, Adrian felt as though someone wasn't just hearing him, they were listening. Meanwhile, Victor remained unaware of the change stirring within his home. He was consumed with meetings, contracts, and the ceaseless demands of an empire that never slept. He told himself that providing luxury was enough for his son, that the boy's silence was just a phase, something he would outgrow with time. What he didn't see, what he had trained himself not to see, was how hollow those gilded halls had become. But Sophia saw. She noticed how Adrian's eyes followed the other children from the garden window, how he tightened his grip on the arms of his chair whenever laughter echoed from outside. She understood loneliness in ways few could because she had lived it herself. And though she was just a maid in a mansion where her presence barely registered, she decided quietly that the boy would not be invisible. It was in those small moments, the fixing of a toy, the simple act of sharing a meal, the willingness to speak to him as a child, rather than a patient or an heir, that the first cracks began to form in the mansion's silence. For the first time in years, Adrian started to believe that maybe he wasn't entirely alone. And, for the first time, the mansion began to stir with something that had been absent for far too long. Not noise, not chaos, but life. The first real breakthrough came one quiet afternoon when Adrian's wheelchair caught on the edge of a rug in the hall. Normally, he would have sighed in defeat and waited for someone to move it out of his way. But before frustration could set in, Sophia appeared. She didn't rush to push him forward, didn't treat him as helpless. Instead, she crouched, adjusted the rug with a grim tug, and looked up at him with a grin. "Now you're the boss," she said lightly. "You lead, I'll follow." Adrian blinked, then tentatively rolled forward. To his surprise, she walked beside him rather than behind, as though he were guiding her instead of the other way around. For the first time in a long while, he felt in control, not just of his chair, but of himself. From then on, Sophia made a habit of turning ordinary obstacles into small victories. When Adrian hesitated at a set of stairs leading to the back garden, she didn't sigh or pity him. She tapped her chin thoughtfully. What if we make our own path? Who says stairs are the only way out? Together, they discovered a side ramp that had been left unused for years, buried beneath overgrown ivy. Sophia cleared it with her hands, dirt streaking her uniform, while Adrian watched with wide-eyed awe. When at last she brushed off her palms and gestured proudly to the ramp, she said, "See? Even the house had a secret way." The moment he rolled down into the sunlight, the wind brushing against his face, Adrian laughed, a clear, ringing sound that startled even himself. Sophia laughed with him, clapping her hands as though he'd just conquered a mountain. It was the first time anyone at the estate had heard the boy laugh since his mother's death. News of it trickled through the staff like wildfire. The boy laughed, they whispered, their disbelief tinged with curiosity. But for Victor Hale, consumed by meetings and late-night strategy calls, the whispers barely registered. He assumed it was an exaggeration, a moment of coincidence. His son was fine, he told himself. Wasn't he already providing everything the boy could need? A personal tutor, the finest doctors, the best therapist money could buy? Surely that was enough. But money couldn't buy what Sophia gave so freely. Dignity, attention, and the simple gift of treating Adrian like any other child. Over time, her influence grew in subtle, almost invisible ways. She encouraged Adrian to play chess again, not as therapy, but as a challenge he could win. She dusted off his sketchbooks, urging him to draw the things he saw outside the window. "You've got eyes like a poet," she told him once, admiring the jagged yet earnest lines of his sketches. "You see things others miss." That single sentence stayed with him, fueling a spark he thought long extinguished. One evening, as the golden light of sunset filled the library, Adrian rolled closer to the window where Sophia was polishing the glass. "Do you think," he began, his voice hesitant, "do you think I could ever walk again?" The question hit Sophia like a stone, but she didn't flinch. She met his gaze with honesty and warmth. "I don't know," she admitted softly, "but I do know you're more than your legs, Adrian. You're brave, you're smart, and you've got a heart that's stronger than you realize. That matters more than anything." Adrian lowered his eyes, but she noticed the faintest glimmer of hope sparking behind them. In the days that followed, something remarkable happened. Adrian started asking for her. If Sophia wasn't in the room, he asked where she had gone. If he discovered she was assigned to another wing of the house, he grew restless until she returned. She had become more than a maid to him. She was a friend, a confidante, the first person who truly saw him for who he was rather than who he had lost. It wasn't long before the household staff noticed, and their whispers grew louder. Some admired her patience, her ability to do what doctors and tutors had failed to. Others scoffed, insisting she was overstepping, getting too close. In a house governed by rigid lines of duty, her tenderness was seen by some as a threat. One evening, Victor finally caught sight of something that made him pause. He had returned home earlier than expected, his footsteps echoing across the marble floor. As he passed the open door of the garden room, he stopped. There, under the fading light of day, Sophia was kneeling beside Adrian. The boy held a paper airplane in his hands, a wide grin on his face. "Ready?" Sophia asked. Adrian nodded, his eyes sparkling with excitement. With a flick of his wrist, the paper airplane soared through the air, dipping and twirling before landing several feet away. Adrian laughed, an unguarded, joyful sound that froze Victor in place. He hadn't heard his son laugh like that in years. Victor's chest tightened, an emotion he couldn't quite name rising unbidden. Yet just as quickly, his business-honed instincts surfaced. Who was this maid to insert herself so deeply into his son's life? He frowned, retreating into the shadows before either noticed him. That night, as Victor sat in his study, surrounded by contracts and ledgers, he found himself distracted by the image of his son's smile. Something in it unsettled him. It wasn't just that Adrian had laughed, it was that someone else had made it happen. Someone outside his control. The more he thought about it, the more restless he became. Meanwhile, Adrian lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling with a small smile on his lips. For the first time since his mother's death, he wasn't afraid of tomorrow, because tomorrow meant Sophia would be there. She was changing more than his days, she was changing his heart. And though neither knew it yet, those small, quiet changes were about to shake the foundations of the Hale mansion and Victor Hale's carefully controlled world in ways no one could have predicted. For in a house built on silence, the sound of a boy's laughter was more powerful than any storm. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, though one no one in the Hale mansion could have predicted. Sophia, with her quiet presence and soft persistence, began to leave little traces of change wherever she went. What had once been a household drowned in silence slowly began to breathe again. Adrian had always kept to himself, his wheelchair tucked away in corners, or left in his room where the curtains were drawn tight. But Sophia, unlike the other staff who avoided the boy as though his silence was a wall they could not climb, simply treated him as she would any other child. She asked no grand questions, demanded no impossible things. Instead, she entered his world gently, as though stepping into a room where someone fragile was trying to heal. One morning, she placed a stack of old sketch pads on the table beside Adrian. "I found these in the storage room," she said, her voice steady but warm. "I can't draw very well, but maybe you can show me how it's done." She set down a pencil beside him and waited. Adrian, who had grown used to people talking around him, not to him, blinked in surprise. His thin fingers hovered over the pencil before he picked it up. At first, he said nothing. He sketched in silence, his movements hesitant but precise. Sophia leaned in just enough to show interest, but not so close as to crowd him. "That looks like the garden outside," she murmured, recognizing the curve of the fountain. Adrian's lips twitched, almost as if he were fighting back a smile. For the first time in months, Someone had noticed what he saw. Later that week, Sophia came to him with a book. "I don't know if you've read this," she said, holding up a worn copy of The Secret Garden. "But when I was your age, I loved how a forgotten place could bloom again with care." She opened it, reading aloud without waiting for permission. Her voice filled the room, carrying the words through the heavy air. Adrian listened, his head tilted slightly, eyes fixed on her rather than the book. The boy, who once never spoke, whispered a question at the end of a chapter. Does the garden really come alive?" His voice was hoarse from disuse, but Sophia's heart nearly broke at the sound. She nodded quickly, smiling as though she had been waiting forever to hear him speak. "Yes, and maybe we could have our own little garden too." The change was slow but undeniable. Meals became less lonely. Instead of eating in silence, Adrian began to sit at the smaller table in the sunroom with Sophia beside him. She would tell stories about small things, her mother's cooking, the sounds of her neighborhood, the silly way birds argued outside the kitchen window. Adrian listened, his eyes following her every gesture, until one day a soft laugh escaped him. The staff froze in the hallway at the sound. It had been months since the boy had laughed. It was Sophia who convinced Adrian to leave the walls of the mansion for the first time. She wheeled him toward the tall glass doors that opened to the gardens. He tensed, his hand gripping the armrest. I don't want people to look." His voice trembled. Sophia crouched to his level, her eyes steady and gentle. "Then don't look at them," she said softly. "Look at the sky, feel the sun. It doesn't care about wheelchairs, neither do I." She pushed open the doors, letting the golden light spill across the marble floor. Slowly, Adrian let himself be guided outside. The scent of roses and freshly cut grass drifted over him, and for the first time since the accident, he lifted his face to the warmth of the sun. They spent the afternoon there. Sophia pointed out birds darting across the fountain, picked flowers to show him their colors, and even dared to splash a little water from the fountain into his hand. Adrian startled, then laughed, a sharp, bright sound that carried through the hedges. His laughter startled even him, but once it escaped, it seemed he could not hold it back. From that day, the gardens became their secret place. Sophia brought sketch pads and books outside, turning the stone bench near the fountain into their haven. Adrian grew bolder, asking small questions, even teasing her about her clumsy drawings. The boy who had once felt invisible now felt seen. But not everyone in the mansion approved. The whispers began in the servants' quarters. "She's overstepping," one muttered. "It isn't her place to play nursemaid. She's just a maid, nothing more." Others were more curious, sneaking glances at the pair with a mix of wonder and jealousy. Few could deny that Adrian looked healthier, livelier when Sophia was near. Victor Hale noticed too, though he told himself it was coincidence. He had little time for childish whims, buried as he was in board meetings, acquisitions, and endless figures. When the reports reached his desk that Adrian had been laughing in the gardens, Victor dismissed them. "Children laugh, it means nothing," he said curtly. Yet in the quiet moments, when he passed the open doors and heard his son's laughter ringing through the air, something stirred inside him, a pang of guilt, sharp and unwelcome. For Adrian, however, the difference was life itself. Each day that Sophia entered his world, he felt less like a shadow and more like a boy again. Her kindness was not born of pity, but of genuine care. And in the golden afternoons of the Hale Gardens, beneath the watchful sun, a smile returned to the boy who had nearly forgotten how to live. The more time Sophia spent with Adrian, the more she discovered pieces of him that the mansion had nearly buried. He wasn't simply a boy trapped in silence and wheels. He was intelligent, sensitive, and surprisingly witty when given the chance. One afternoon, as the sun set in streaks of pink and gold, Sophia spread a chessboard across the garden table. "Do you know how to play?" she asked, her tone light. Adrian's eyes lit with a flicker of pride. "Father taught me, once," he whispered. His hand hesitated, then moved a pawn. From that moment on, chess became their quiet ritual. Sophia was clumsy at first, losing in a matter of moves. Adrian smirked, the tiniest curve of his lip, before saying, "You should protect your queen, not sacrifice her so soon." She laughed at her own mistakes, and the boy laughed with her. With each game, she let him feel not as a patient, not as fragile, but as capable. Soon, Sophia layered small joys into every day. She brought watercolor paints and encouraged him to splash colors on thick paper, no matter how messy. She set up bowls of flour and sugar in the kitchen one rainy afternoon, daring him to try stirring a cake batter. The staff nearly fainted at the sight of the young master's wheelchair smudged with flour, but Adrian's delighted grin silenced their protests. The mansion, long a place of order and rules, began to change. Laughter echoed where silence had once reigned. The sound unsettled some servants. To them, Sophia was dangerous, not because she was cruel, but because she was succeeding. They had grown used to treating Adrian as a fragile ornament. She treated him as a boy who could live again. Whispers swirled in the servants' halls. "She'll lose her position if Mr. Hale finds out," one maid hissed, wringing her hands. "He doesn't like people meddling," another shook her head. "But the boy, he smiles now. Have you seen it? She's doing what none of us could." Envy battled admiration, and the mansion hummed with quiet unrest. Victor Hale, however, continued to dismiss the transformation. His days were crowded with numbers and negotiations, his nights with contracts that stretched into the early hours. He told himself that if Adrian was improving, it was only natural. Still, he could not ignore the reports that reached him more frequently. His son had asked to eat in the garden. His son had laughed. His son had even spoken during dinner one evening, a halting question about the merger Victor was overseeing. That night, as Victor stood in his study with the curtains half closed, he caught the faint sound of laughter drifting in from the gardens. He froze. It was Adrian's voice, unmistakable and bright. Something tightened in his chest. For years he had told himself his distance was necessary. Business first, emotions later. But now he wondered if he had let the boy drift too far, if perhaps he had been a stranger in his own son's world. The next morning, Victor descended the stairs earlier than usual. He intended to leave for the office, but paused as he saw Sophia wheeling Adrian across the marble floor. She bent low to show him something hidden in her apron pocket, a folded paper bird. Adrian held it as though it were made of glass. "Teach me," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. Victor's eyes narrowed, though not in anger. He studied the scene quietly. His son looked alive, different. He said nothing, only turned and left for his car. Yet the image burned in his mind all day. For Adrian, each small activity restored something he thought was lost. He no longer dreaded mornings. Instead, he woke hoping Sophia would arrive with another surprise, new pencils, a puzzle, a story. And each time she smiled at him, the heaviness in his chair lifted. He began to believe he was more than his chair, more than the accident that had stolen his legs. But Sophia, though she celebrated every smile, knew how fragile progress could be. She guarded his joy fiercely, shielding him from cruel whispers or pitying glances. When a footman muttered that Adrian should accept his limit, Sophia's eyes flashed, and she calmly replied, "Limits are not chains. He's still a boy, he still deserves life." The footman fell silent under her gaze. A turning point came one clear afternoon. Sophia wheeled Adrian to the fountain, the same place where he had first laughed again. A breeze rustled the roses, scattering petals across the water. Sophia sat on a stone bench, pulling out a small kite she had pieced together with scraps from the laundry. "Kite?" Adrian asked, his brow furrowed. She said simply. "The wind doesn't care about chairs either." She tied the string to his hand and let the fabric lift. At first, the kite wobbled clumsily, threatening to nosedive, but then the breeze caught and the little kite soared. Adrian gasped, his grip tightening. For the first time he felt the tug of the wind, the thrill of holding something that flew. He laughed, loud and unrestrained. "It's flying. I'm flying it." His voice carried across the garden, and for a moment he forgot the chair beneath him. He was simply a boy chasing the sky. From a balcony above, Victor paused on his way to a call. He leaned over the railing, his eyes fixed on the boy below. Adrian's face was alight, joy spilling from every expression. Sophia stood beside him, her hands loose on the chair, but her gaze fixed on Adrian, proud and steady. Victor felt something he could not name. Jealousy, perhaps, or regret? His son had never looked at him that way. He turned away before anyone could see him watching. That evening, the mansion buzzed with whispers of what they had seen. The boys smiled all day, the cook told the butler. It was like the sun returned. Some muttered that Sophia was overstepping, but no one could deny that Adrian's transformation was nothing short of a miracle. Sophia tucked Adrian into bed that night, smoothing the blankets. "You did well today," she said softly. "You laughed, you flew a kite, you're living again." Adrian blinked up at her, his eyes glassy with emotion. You make me feel normal," he whispered. "Like I'm not broken." Her heart ached, but she forced a steady smile. "You're not broken, Adrian. You're stronger than anyone here knows." She brushed his hair from his forehead. "And tomorrow, we'll find another way to smile." He nodded, his eyelids heavy with sleep. For the first time in a long time, he drifted off with peace in his chest. And so, in the quiet glow of the Hale mansion, a boy who had forgotten joy found it again in laughter, sunlight, and the kindness of one woman who refused to let him fade. Little did they know, the ripple of those moments would soon shake the house far beyond its walls. The mansion had grown used to silence. Its marble floors echoed only with the measured footsteps of staff. Its hallways lined with art and portraits seemed more like a museum than a home. For years now, laughter had been absent from its walls, replaced with cold order and restrained whispers. Victor Hale had built his fortune on control, efficiency, and the demand for absolute discipline. His home mirrored that command. But on this evening, as he returned earlier than usual from the office, he heard something that didn't belong. It started faintly, an odd rumble echoing through the corridor, like wheels rolling fast over polished stone. Then, a sound sharper, lighter, more piercing than any meeting room victory or signed contract. It was a laugh, not just any laugh, but his son's. Adrian's laughter, bright and unrestrained, sliced through the air like sunlight through storm clouds. Victor froze. For a moment he thought he was imagining it, a cruel trick of memory. But then it came again, higher this time, mixed with a squeal of joy. He followed the sound, each step hesitant, as though walking into unfamiliar territory. As he rounded the corner of the East Wing hallway, he stopped abruptly. There they were. Adrian sat in his wheelchair, small hands gripping the sides tightly, his dark hair flopping as the chair tilted slightly from side to side. Behind him was Sophia, the maid he had scarcely noticed beyond her uniform and bowed head. But now, she was transformed. Eyes shining, laughter spilling from her lips as she pushed the wheelchair down the corridor at a playful pace. Playfully, "Faster, Sophia, faster," Adrian cried, his voice full of life Victor hadn't heard in months. "Hold on, champion, or your father's hallways will turn into a racetrack," she teased, pretending to swerve as Adrian squealed again, clutching his sides from the rush of excitement. Victor stood hidden by the shadow of a tall column, unable to move. The scene before him seemed alien and intimate all at once. His son was alive, not in the fragile, subdued way he usually was, but vibrant, radiant. That sound, his laughter, hit Victor like a blow. He had forgotten what it was like to hear it, forgotten how his late wife's eyes used to glow whenever Adrian giggled as a toddler. For the first time in years, Victor's cold facade cracked. His jaw tightened, his chest ached, and he found himself clutching the marble edge of the column to steady himself. It was not anger he felt, though part of him wanted to step forward and demand why his son was being raced through his hallways. No, it was something heavier. Guilt, pride, and confusion collided inside him. He stayed still, unwilling to break the moment. Sophia slowed the chair eventually, kneeling in front of Adrian so they were eye level. "See? You can fly without wings, Adrian. You just need a little push." Adrian's grin softened, and he leaned forward. "Thank you, Sophia. I felt normal again." His voice wavered on that word, normal. It was a word he rarely spoke, one Victor had heard in the boy's silence, in the way Adrian avoided mirrors or gatherings, shrinking into himself. Sophia's hand rested gently on the boy's arm. "You are normal, Adrian. You're more than normal. You're extraordinary, and don't let anyone, not even yourself, tell you otherwise." Victor's throat tightened. That word, extraordinary, had once been his wife's favorite description of their son. He remembered her holding Adrian as a baby, whispering it into his ear like a prayer. She used to say that Adrian's heart was stronger than any child she'd ever seen, even before tragedy struck. And now, here was a maid speaking those same truths his wife had believed. Truths Victor himself had buried beneath years of grief and distance. He lingered longer in the shadows than he should have. A part of him told him to step forward, to let Adrian see he had witnessed this, to thank Sophia for awakening something that had long been dead. But he couldn't. His pride rooted him to the spot, and his fear of confronting the emptiness between himself and his son kept his lips sealed. When the laughter faded and the two disappeared into Adrian's room, Victor remained in the hallway. He stood there long after the sounds had vanished, staring at the polished marble floor as though it held answers. That night, Victor retired to his study instead of the dining hall. He poured himself a drink, staring into the glass as though it held the same clarity as his business decisions. But no deal, no merger, no financial report could distract him from what he had seen. His son, alive with joy. His son cared for by someone who did not see wealth or disability, only a child. And himself, a father who had not known how to give such moment. He leaned back in his chair, letting the memories resurface. His wife's laughter, the way she used to dance with Adrian in the living room, spinning him in circles until they both collapsed in giggles. Her voice, telling him again and again, "Victor, remember, he needs love more than anything else. Don't bury him under the weight of your empire." But he had buried himself in work. When she died, he told himself it was the only way to cope, the only way to survive the emptiness. Now, staring into the shadows of his office, he wondered if in building walls around his grief, he had also built walls between himself and his son. Sleep did not come easily that night. Every time Victor closed his eyes, he heard Adrian's laughter, sharp and clear, echoing in his mind. It was a sound both healing and haunting, a reminder of what he had lost and perhaps what could still be reclaimed. For the first time in years, Victor Hale felt unsure. The next morning, the mansion stirred with its usual rhythm. Staff hurrying about, meals served with precision, routines unbroken. Yet for Victor, the air felt different. He rose earlier than usual, his thoughts still tangled from the night before. When he passed Adrian's room, he paused outside the door, hearing the faint sound of Sophia's voice. She was reading aloud, her tone warm and animated, painting vivid pictures with words. Adrian's soft chuckle followed her sentences, and Victor found himself pressing his palm against the doorframe. He hadn't heard his son engage like this in so long. The guilt returned, sharper, cutting deeper into him. During breakfast, he observed Adrian more carefully. The boy was quieter in front of others, retreating into himself the way Victor was used to seeing. But there was a faint spark now, a small light that hadn't been there before. Victor noticed how Adrian glanced occasionally toward the doorway, waiting for Sophia to reappear, the corners of his lips twitching upward when she finally did. Victor said nothing. His silence was his habit, his shield. But he saw. Later that evening, he found himself wandering the East Wing again. He didn't admit to himself what he was searching for until he heard it. The sound of wheels, faint and rhythmic. He followed quietly, his polished quietly on the carpeted floor. Again, he witnessed it. Sophia pushed Adrian slowly this time, their pace calm. They weren't racing, but drifting down the hall, as she described, constellations painted across the high-ceiling mural. Adrian tilted his head back, eyes wide, as though truly seeing the stars for the first time. Victor's chest constricted. He had passed that mural countless times and never thought of it as anything more than decoration. Now, in his son's eyes, it was a universe. He thought of his wife again, how she used to pause at small details others ignored, how she insisted that Adrian see beauty even in ordinary things. It struck him how much Sophia resembled that spirit. Not in appearance, but in the way she breathed warmth into cold spaces. Victor withdrew before they noticed him, retreating into the solitude of his study once more. But the image stayed with him, pressing against his composure. That night, memories overwhelmed him. He sat at his desk, staring at an old photograph he rarely allowed himself to look at. His wife, radiant, holding Adrian in her arms, both of them laughing at something unseen. He traced their faces with his eyes, aching with the weight of time lost. "Am I failing him?" he whispered into the empty room. The question hung heavy in the silence, unanswered. The truth was undeniable. He had shielded himself with work, with control, with wealth, convincing himself it was for Adrian's future. But what future was worth building if the present was barren of love? His son needed him, not just his empire. For hours, Victor sat in the dim glow of his study lamp, wrestling with thoughts he had long buried. Pride told him he was fine, that delegating care was natural for a man of his position. But guilt whispered louder, reminding him of what he had seen: Adrian's joy with Sophia, his laughter, his spark of life. By dawn, Victor hadn't slept. He rose with the first light and stood before his window, staring out at the sprawling gardens. The mansion was silent again, but he knew that somewhere within its walls his son had begun to live again. Not because of him, but because of a maid who dared to see Adrian for who he truly was. For the first time in years, Victor Hale felt something shift. His certainty wavered, his control cracked, and his heart, long buried beneath grief and steel, began to stir. The whispers started as faint ripples, carried through corridors too vast to contain. The Hale mansion, known for its cold precision and reputation of order, had always been a fortress against rumors. Yet now, behind polished doors and marble floors, a story was spreading, one that blended truth with venom. It began with the staff. One afternoon, a kitchen maid spotted Sophia wheeling Adrian down the long gallery. The boy's laughter rang out, startling everyone within earshot. The sound had been absent for so long that it felt almost foreign. The maid froze, tray in hand, and then whispered to another, "Did you hear that?" The boy laughed. By evening, the whispers turned into a narrative, the maid who brought back the boy's smile. But admiration was not the only emotion stirred. Envy sprouted quickly. Older maids who had served the household for decades resented Sophia's sudden importance. A butler, who prided himself on loyalty to Victor, sneered that Sophia was stepping above her station. Then came the twist. A senior housekeeper, Mrs. Granger, a woman rigid with pride and accustomed to wielding her authority like a scepter, began to spread darker suspicions. She described Sophia's presence not as kindness, but as manipulation. "She knows what she's doing," Mrs. Granger muttered in the servants' hall. "Attach yourself to the boy and you'll secure a place in the master's favor. She's scheming for attention, mark my words." By the next morning, gossip spilled beyond the gates. Guests at luncheons murmured about it. High society, with its hunger for scandal, painted Sophia as an ambitious maid aiming for more than employment. "Victor Hale's son has taken to a maid," they whispered over champagne. Perhaps the widower himself might follow. Victor, as always, was the last to hear. He had been drowning in work, attending board meetings and silencing competitors, yet when a trusted associate leaned across a polished oak table and said, "There are rumors circulating about your household," he stiffened. The associate's lips curled into something between amusement and concern. "They say your maid spends too much time with Adrian," people are asking. That night, Victor returned to the mansion with his jaw tight, his mind wrestling with anger. He hated gossip, hated the vultures who circled his family name, but more than that, he hated the gnawing thought that he had not noticed any of it himself. He summoned Mrs. Granger, who wasted no time in fueling the fire. Her words were coated with false concern. "Mr. Hale, I have only your son's well-being in mind, but this girl, Sophia, she has grown far too close. She sits at his meals, she plays games, she even takes him to the gardens. It is not proper. The staff talk, the society pages will talk soon too." Victor's eyes narrowed. "You're saying she neglects her duties?" Mrs. Granger hesitated, then pressed harder. "I'm saying, sir, that her intentions may not be as pure as they seem. Affection is one thing, attachment quite another." Victor dismissed her, though her words echoed in his mind long after. Late that night, he paced his study, torn between pride and suspicion. He remembered Adrian's laughter, a sound that had haunted his dreams in its absence. Sophia had brought it back. And yet, the world outside saw scandal, not salvation. By morning, his decision was made. He would confront Sophia. She was summoned while dusting the library shelves. The summons alone made her tremble. Walking the long hall to Victor's office felt like approaching a judgment. She stepped inside, her hands clasped tightly together, and found him waiting imposing behind his desk. the glow of the lamp sharpening his features into something stern, almost merciless. "Sit," he ordered. His voice carried the weight of command, the tone that made seasoned executives quake. Sophia obeyed, her heart pounding. Victor leaned forward. "There are rumors, Miss Ramirez, about you, about your closeness with my son. Tell me, why does a maid concern herself so deeply with things outside her duty?" The words cut deep, though his tone was controlled. Sophia felt her throat tighten, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "Because he is a child," she said softly. "Not just your heir, not a patient, not a fragile thing to be pitied. He is a boy who needed someone to treat him as such." Victor's brow furrowed. "And you believe that is your place?" Sophia's voice trembled, but grew stronger with each word. "I never thought of place. I thought of him. No one sat with him at meals. No one asked him about his favorite books. He was alone in a house filled with people. I couldn't bear to see it." Her eyes glistened, but her tone carried no hint of self-defense for her own sake. "It was only for Adrian. If I overstepped, then forgive me. But I would rather lose my position than let him keep feeling like a burden in his own home." The room fell silent. Victor's hand tightened on the armrest of his chair. He had summoned her, excuses, perhaps denial. Instead, she had given him something he could not counter. Truth, unpolished and raw. For a long moment, he said nothing, only studying her. His chest ached with a memory he had buried. His late wife's laughter as she once held Adrian in her arms, whispering, "Promise me, Victor. He'll always know he's enough." When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, stripped of its usual steel. "You will continue," he said. "Do what you've been doing. But understand this, the world beyond these walls will not see your sincerity. They will not understand, and they will be cruel to you." Sophia bowed her head, relief and fear colliding within her chest. "Then let them whisper. I will endure it, for Adrian's sake." Victor watched her leave, his expression unreadable. Yet deep inside, something stirred. Recognition, an unwelcome respect. He could not yet admit it aloud, but her words had unsettled the walls he had built around his heart. The whispers, however, were far from silent. Sophia returned to her duties with her resolve sharper than before. The air around the mansion, however, thickened with tension. Servants eyed her with veiled suspicion, whispers chasing her down the hallways like shadows. She walked straighter, though, carrying trays. The boy sensed it too. One afternoon, while Sophia adjusted the blanket over his lap in the garden, he looked up with solemn eyes. "They're angry with you, aren't they?" Sophia forced a small smile. "It's because of me," Adrian whispered, guilt clouding his face. Sophia crouched beside him, gently taking his hand. "No, Adrian, it's because people don't always understand what's good for the heart. They see things and twist them. But you are worth every whisper." For the first time, Adrian leaned into her embrace without hesitation. Meanwhile, Victor remained distant, but he watched. At dinner, he noticed Adrian speaking more. When Victor entered a room, Adrian no longer shrank into silence but looked up, sometimes even daring to smile. Each flicker of change was undeniable, and each time he caught himself glancing at Sophia, quietly acknowledging her role, though he said nothing. Still, gossip clawed deeper into high society. At a gala, Victor overheard hushed tones. "The maid," someone laughed behind a glass of wine. "It's always the help, isn't it? First the boy, next the billionaire himself." The words burned, but he did not respond. He only clenched his fist and left early, the laughter still echoing in his. Inside the mansion, Mrs. Granger's bitterness festered. She cornered Sophia one morning, her words dripping venom. "Don't think this will last. Men like Mr. Hale don't think girls like you. You'll be discarded soon enough." Sophia refused to bite back. Instead, she simply whispered, "As long as Adrian is smiling, I don't care what happens to me." Then she walked away, leaving Mrs. Granger fuming at her composure. But the strain weighed heavier with each passing day. At night, Sophia lay awake in her small servants' quarters, the ceiling looming above her. She had come to this house for work, nothing more, yet now she carried the weight of whispers, envy, and scrutiny. Still, she could not walk away. Not when Adrian's laughter was finally returning. fragile but real. Victor, too, wrestled with conflict. Alone in his study, he sat staring at a photograph of his late wife, her eyes bright even in stillness. He heard Sophia's trembling voice in his memory, her plea that Adrian deserved to feel like a child again. He thought of his wife's last words, the promises he had broken in his obsession with business and control. And for the first time, guilt pressed, heavier than the empire he carried. Late one evening, Victor found himself standing outside Adrian's room. He did not enter, but listened as Sophia read aloud from a book, her voice steady, warm. Adrian's laughter bubbled between passages. The sound pierced through the fortress of his chest, reaching a place he had long believed dead. He leaned against the wall, unseen, his breath catching as he realized the truth. Sophia had given his son something he himself had not been able to provide. The next morning, when the newspapers once again hinted at whispers of scandal, Victor folded them silently and set them aside. His empire thrived on controlling narratives, silencing critics, and bending the world to his will. But here, within these walls, he was helpless before the sincerity of a maid and the laughter of his son. That evening, Victor called Sophia to him that night. She walked in, bracing herself for reprimand, but instead, he spoke quietly. "You may not care what they say, but I do. Adrian's future is tied to this name, to this house. Do you understand the risk you're taking?" Sophia met his gaze, her eyes calm despite the storm swirling around them. "I understand. But if I protect his name while he loses his childhood, then what kind of future is that?" Victor was struck silent. Her courage unsettled him, forcing him to confront truths he had long buried. For the first time, his voice softened. "You are stronger than you look, Miss Ramirez." Sophia bowed her head but said nothing. After she left, Victor lingered by the window, the night stretching before him. The whispers of society had become a battle cry outside, but inside, a different truth was taking root. The maid's quiet vow echoed in his thoughts. "Let them whisper. I will endure it for Adrian's sake." And deep within, Victor felt something he had not in years: respect and a dangerous spark of hope. The mansion was changing, so was he. Adrian had grown used to silence after the accident. Silence had become his shield, his invisible fortress that kept the world from seeing the ache he carried. But with Sophia in the mansion, silence slowly gave way to something new. Laughter, it wasn't constant or loud, but it was there, like sunlight breaking through a crack in the curtains. He began asking for her by name, and then one afternoon, with a determined frown that melted into a smile, he told her he didn't want to call her Miss Sophia anymore. "You're not just a maid," Adrian said, his voice tentative but clear. "You're my friend." The words lingered in the air, sweet and powerful. Sophia's eyes softened. She had been called many things in her life: servant, worker, stranger, but rarely friend. She knelt by his wheelchair, her hand resting gently over his. "Then, I am honored, Adrian," she whispered, "because friends are the family we choose." From that day forward, their bond deepened. Sophia encouraged Adrian in ways no one else dared. She brought paper and colored pencils to his room, coaxing him to sketch what he saw from the window: the sprawling gardens, the grand fountains, the hawks circling above the cliffs. His drawings were shaky at first, but with each attempt his confidence. When he doubted himself, saying his hands weren't strong enough, Sophia countered. "Strength isn't about perfect lines, Adrian. It's about trying again, even when it's hard." She read aloud to him from her favorite books, choosing stories filled with courage, loyalty, and hope. Adrian's eyes would widen as knights rode into battle or as lost children found their way home. He began to add his own twists to the tales, whispering imaginative endings, and Sophia always listened as if his stories were treasures. One afternoon she brought him to the conservatory, where sunlight poured through tall windows like liquid gold. "Close your eyes," she said gently. "What do you hear?" He frowned. "The fountain." "And the birds?" She leaned closer. "The world is still here, Adrian. It hasn't left you behind." He opened his eyes then, and for the first time a small laugh escaped him. It was a fragile sound, but it was real. The staff began to notice. Whispers floated in the halls, some in awe, others in envy. They spoke of how the boy, once trapped in sorrow, now smiled again because of the quiet maid. Some muttered that Sophia had bewitched him, that she was seeking favor in ways others had failed. But she paid them no mind. Her focus was Adrian, always Adrian. Then, one stormy night, the boy fell ill. A sudden fever swept over him, leaving him trembling in his bed, his skin clammy, his breath shallow. The doctor was called, but the storm delayed his arrival. Hours stretched into eternity. Most of the staff retreated, frightened of being blamed should the boy worsen. But not Sophia. She sat at his side, wringing out cool cloths to press against his forehead. She whispered soothing words, brushing damp hair back from his face, humming lullabies her mother once sang to her. Adrian whimpered in his sleep, clutching her hand with a desperate grip. She never let go. Through the night, she remained, eyes heavy with exhaustion but unwavering. She prayed silently, begged silently, willing the fever to break. Victor arrived in the early hours, his expression carved from stone, though his eyes betrayed the storm inside him. He paused at the doorway, stunned by what he saw. Sophia was there, shoulders slumped from fatigue, but still alert, still holding Adrian's hand as if her will alone tethered him to life. She looked up, and for a fleeting moment their eyes met. Victor's dark and unreadable, Sophia's tired yet resolute. "Be stable for now," she whispered, her voice hoarse but steady. Victor didn't speak at first. He simply stepped closer, his gaze shifting to his son's flushed face. In that silence, something cracked inside him. For years he had hidden behind walls of control and ruthlessness, but watching Sophia care for Adrian with such devotion stirred something buried. It was warmth. The doctor finally arrived, declaring the fever a passing infection. By then, Adrian had begun to stir, murmuring Sophia's name before drifting back into sleep. Victor saw the relief wash over her, and in that instant, he realized she was no ordinary maid. She was something far more. That night, while the storm raged outside, Victor lingered in the quiet of the sick room. He watched Sophia tend to Adrian as though the boy were her own, and an unfamiliar thought unsettled him. Perhaps she was exactly what both father and son had been missing all along. The next morning, Adrian awoke weak but smiling faintly when he saw Sophia. "You stayed?" he whispered. "I told you," she said softly, squeezing his hand. "Friends don't leave." And in that moment, something unspoken shifted, not just between Adrian and Sophia, but between Sophia and Victor as well. The bond between them all had begun to weave itself, quiet but undeniable. The storm passed, but the memory of that night lingered in Victor's mind. For the first time in years, he had witnessed someone care for his son without obligation, without expectation of reward. It unsettled him, challenged the walls he had built around himself. He found himself watching Sophia more closely, not with suspicion as before, but with reluctant curiosity. In the early mornings, when she brought tea for Adrian, Victor noticed the gentleness of her hands, the way her smile carried no pretense. At night, when the mansion's corridors grew silent, he would sometimes find her in the library, reading aloud to Adrian until the boy's eyelids. It was in those small moments that Victor felt something stirring, something dangerous yet undeniable. One evening, after Adrian had fallen asleep, Victor entered the library. Sophia started, nearly dropping the book she held. "Tail," she stammered, rising to her feet. "Sit," Victor said, his voice lower than usual, less sharp. "You've done enough standing today." Hesitant, she obeyed. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fireplace. Finally, Victor spoke. "You stayed with him, through the fever?" His gaze remained fixed on the flames. "Most would not." "I couldn't leave him," Sophia replied softly. "He needed someone to remind him he isn't alone." Victor turned then, his eyes locking onto hers. "And what about you? Who reminds you?" The question caught her off guard. No one had asked her that in years. She swallowed, choosing her words carefully. "I remind myself, because sometimes that's the only choice people like me have." Something flickered in Victor's expression. Respect, perhaps, or recognition of strength. He poured 2 cups of tea and handed one to her. For a moment, they sat like equals, not master and maid, but two people bound by quiet truths. Conversations began to follow, quiet ones shared in the late hours after Adrian was asleep. They spoke not of wealth or power, but of childhood memories, of loss, of the dreams they never voiced aloud. Victor told her of the ocean trips his late wife loved, how she had wanted Adrian to see the world. Sophia shared stories of her village where nights were filled with laughter even when the cupboards were bare. Through those exchanges, a fragile warmth began to bloom. Meanwhile, Adrian's bond with Sophia grew stronger each day. He painted clumsy portraits of her, insisting she hang them by his bedside. He asked her to tell him stories before bed, not the ones from books, but her own stories, the ones of her family, of her life before the mansion. "She's my best friend," Adrian told Victor one afternoon, his smile shy but proud. "Not just a maid, my best friend." Victor didn't correct him. For once, he allowed himself to agree silently. But not everyone in the mansion approved. Whispers grew louder, fueled by envy and curiosity. Some staff questioned why Victor spent time speaking with Sophia when he rarely acknowledged others. Rumors slithered beyond the gates into high society, painting Sophia as ambitious, perhaps even dangerous. Victor heard the murmurs, but when he saw Adrian's laughter return, he found himself unwilling to care. Then came another stormy night. Adrian awoke, coughing, fear in his eyes. Sophia rushed to his side, soothing him with gentle words, holding him close until his breathing steadied. Victor arrived moments later, only to find her already there, calming the boy as though she were his anchor. When Adrian finally fell asleep, Victor stood in the doorway, something breaking loose in his chest. He spoke quietly, almost to himself. "You make him feel alive again." Sophia turned to him, exhaustion etched into her face. "He is alive, Mr. Hale. He just needed someone to remind him." The words pierced deeper than she realized. For Victor, it wasn't just about Adrian anymore. For the first time in years, he felt as if someone was reminding him too. From that night forward, their bond deepened. It was not loud or obvious, but in the stolen glances, the quiet conversations, and the moments where silence no longer felt heavy, but safe. Victor Hale, the man known for his ruthless empire and unshakable control, found himself undone by the quiet maid who had brought light back into his son's world, and perhaps into his own as well. The invitation was embossed in gold, carrying the weight of expectation. The Blackwell Foundation's annual charity gala was the event of the year, an evening where wealth, power, and philanthropy met under a glittering chandelier. For Victor, it was routine, another stage on which his presence was expected. For Adrian, it was the beginning of a trial she had never prepared for. Victor had decided, almost impulsively, that Adrian would attend this year. He told himself it was for the boy's sake, that the world deserved to see his son's resilience, not his weakness. But deep down, something had shifted. Sophia's unwavering care had peeled back layers he didn't know he still carried. He wanted to prove to himself and to his late wife that he could be the father Adrian needed. On the afternoon of the gala, the mansion hummed with a nervous energy. Tailors arrived with sleek suits, designers with delicate accessories. Adrian sat quietly in his chair, overwhelmed by the fuss. His fingers fidgeted against the armrests until Sophia knelt beside him. "You don't have to be nervous," she whispered with a warm smile. "We'll go together. Think of it like one of our little adventures." Adrian's lips tugged into a hesitant grin. "Will they laugh at me?" Her heart clenched. She brushed a curl from his forehead. "They might, but if they do, remember, those laughs don't belong to you. They belong to people who don't understand. You have nothing to be ashamed of, Adrian. You are stronger than all of them put together." And he nodded, a flicker of courage in his eyes. When the suit was placed on him, tailored to perfection, Sophia helped adjust the bow tie. He looked every bit the heir to Victor Blackwell's empire, though the wheelchair remained. To him, it wasn't just a chair, it was the cage that reminded him daily of what he had lost. But tonight, Sophia's voice echoed louder than the doubt. Victor, dressed immaculately in a black tuxedo, entered the room just as Sophia adjusted Adrian's cufflinks. He paused, something in his chest tightening at the sight. His son looked regal, and beside him, Sophia glowed in a simple evening dress Victor had insisted she wear. It wasn't lavish compared to the gowns of high society, but it brought out the quiet dignity in her. She looked less like staff and more like someone who belonged. The drive to the hotel ballroom was quiet, filled only with the muted hum of the city beyond tinted windows. Sophia sat beside Adrian, her hand occasionally brushing against his to reassure him. Victor watched through the reflection in the glass, his mind a storm. He could already predict the whispers, the judgment. His world thrived on appearances, and tonight, appearances would turn into weapons. The gala unfolded in a cascade of crystal chandeliers, champagne flutes, and laughter that rang too sharp. The Blackwells were announced, and the room turned in unison. Murmurs rippled like a tide when they saw the boy in the wheelchair and the young maid walking by his side. Some smiled politely, others let their disdain show. "Is that Victor's son?" one man whispered. "Tragic, isn't it? And who is that woman? Surely not a guest." The words floated, poisonous and sharp, but Sophia kept her gaze steady. She pushed Adrian forward gently, refusing to let him feel the sting of their judgment. Adrian squeezed her hand once, grateful. Victor led them through the hall, exchanging cold nods with other tycoons. He could feel the stares but refused to acknowledge them. He told himself this was about Adrian, not about appearances. Yet, with each passing glance, his pride wrestled with his shame. Dinner was served, the clinking of silverware filling the grand room. Sophia sat beside Adrian, guiding him when he struggled with the utensils. She did it quietly, gracefully, as though she had always belonged there. But the whispers grew louder, as if it were true. "A maid," someone muttered behind a fan. "Victor must be desperate." Inappropriate. Imagine bringing staff to this. And then came the cruelty. A tall woman in a sequined gown approached the table, her voice saccharine. She bent low, her eyes fixed on Adrian with a pity that was more venom than compassion. "Darling," she cooed, "I didn't know Victor had brought his little invalid tonight. How brave of you to come out in public." Adrian froze. The words sliced him open, leaving him bare before the crowd. His eyes darted to Sophia, his face drips with shame. The woman's gaze flicked to Sophia next. "And who might you be? Oh wait, don't tell me. A companion? No, you're far too plain for that." "Ah, of course. The help." Her laughter, sharp as glass, echoed through the table. A few others chuckled, some shifted uncomfortably, but no one stepped forward. Adrian's chest rose and fell rapidly, his fists clenched against the chair. Then, with a trembling voice that cut through the room, he shouted. "Absurd for Susie, who is completely immersed in the case. She's not just the help, she's my family." Silence. The orchestra faltered mid-note. All eyes turned. The boy's face was red with emotion, his voice breaking but strong enough to carry. "She's the only one who makes me feel like I'm not broken. She's the only one who makes me laugh. She's my friend, my sister, my family, and I won't let you laugh at her." Tears welled in Sophia's eyes. The woman stepped back, startled. No one had expected the boy in the chair to speak, let alone defend with such fire. Victor rose slowly. The weight of years, of pride, of silence pressed on him, but Adrian's words shattered something within. His voice, when it came, was low but thunderous. "Your son is right." Every whisper died. Every head turned. Victor's gaze swept the room, cold and sharp. "This woman is not merely staff. She is the reason Adrian has found his smile again. She is the reason he is here tonight. She is not just a maid. She is the beating heart of this." Gasps filled the hall. The declaration was scandalous, unthinkable in their circles, but Victor didn't care. He placed his hand firmly on Adrian's shoulder, grounding him. His eyes softened for a moment as they flicked to Sophia. "If anyone here has a problem with that," he continued, his voice like iron, "then they have a problem with me." The woman in sequins shrank back, humiliated. The silence stretched, and then, slowly, applause began at the far end of the room. A few clapped hesitantly, then more joined, until the hall rang with reluctant but undeniable approval. Sophia bowed her head, overwhelmed. Adrian leaned into her, whispering, "I told them." She squeezed his hand, her voice breaking. "Yes, you did, Adrian. You told the whole world." But Victor stood tall, his chest rising with a strange mix of pride and fear. Tonight had changed everything, and there was no turning back. The silence that followed Adrian's outburst stretched like an unbroken thread through the grand ballroom. The chandeliers glimmered above, their crystals casting trembling fragments of light onto faces frozen in shock. Guests exchanged wary glances, as if uncertain how to react to a child's voice shattering the delicate fabric of elitist decorum. But Adrian was undaunted. His small hands gripped the armrests of his wheelchair as if bracing himself against the world. His eyes, clear and earnest, searched for Sophia's faith. "Here is my family," he said again, softer this time, but with conviction that shook Victor to his core. For a moment, Victor forgot the audience, the murmurs, the social hierarchies that ruled their lives. All he saw was his son's courage, born not from wealth or privilege, but from love. He felt pride stir within him, mingled with the painful reminder of how little he had given Adrian compared to this young woman who stood beside him. Sophia's lips trembled, her breath catching as she looked down at Adrian. A tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. She wanted to kneel, to hold him, to tell him she would never abandon him, no matter what others thought. But she stood frozen, terrified that any movement might break the fragile truth he had just declared. From the corner of the room, the mocking socialite scoffed. "Family? My dear boy, she's a servant. Your father is letting you indulge in childish fantasy." Her tone was thick with disdain, like acid meant to corrode the boy's pride. Victor's gaze snapped to her, his eyes sharp as steel. He stepped forward, placing himself between Adrian and the woman's words. The crowd leaned in, sensing that the moment had shifted, that something unprecedented was about to unfold. He sighed. "Your sign is not indulging in fantasy," Victor said, his voice low but carrying through the entire room. "What you have just witnessed is truth, unvarnished and pure. A truth most of you wouldn't recognize because your lives are built on facades." Gasps rippled through the room. No one was accustomed to hearing Victor Blackwell, the aloof, calculating tycoon, speak with such rawness. He rested his hand lightly on Adrian's shoulder. "This boy has endured more pain in his short years than most of you ever will, and in that pain, he has found someone who gives him joy, who treats him as a child and not a broken thing. Do you dare mock that?" The socialite faltered, her smirk faltering into a nervous twitch. The crowd remained hushed, torn between discomfort and fascination. Victor turned slightly, his gaze shifting to Sophia. She stood pale, her eyes wide, as though she herself could not believe what she was hearing. "She is not just a maid," Victor continued, his words deliberate, each one carrying the weight of a vow. "She is the reason my son smiles again. She is the reason he dares to dream again. And for that, she is beyond any title you could scorn her with." Adrian's small hand slid into Sophia's, as natural as breathing. She clutched it, unable to speak, afraid her voice would crumble under the storm of emotions rising within her. The guests stirred uneasily, whispers threading through the air like restless ghosts. Some admired the boy's bravery and the father's defense. Others muttered of impropriety, of blurred boundaries that society would never condone. One older gentleman, a business associate of Victor's, cleared his throat. "Victor, with respect, are you truly suggesting this maid belongs in your household as something more than staff?" Victor's jaw tightened. He had never spoken personal words at such gatherings. Everything about his life was always strictly business. But tonight, looking at Adrian and Sophia, he realized business had no meaning if his home remained a place of emptiness. "Ed," he said at last, his voice ringing clear, "I am saying she belongs. Because she has given my son something no fortune of mine ever could. Hope." The weight of his declaration seemed to reverberate against the marble floors and golden pillars. The gala, once a stage for glittering vanity, had turned into a courtroom where truth was put on trial. Sophia lowered her gaze, her chest aching. She had never asked recognition, never desired to be thrust into the merciless spotlight of the elite. All she had wanted was for Adrian to feel alive again. Yet here she stood, caught in the eye of a storm she could not escape. Later that evening, as the gala wound down and guests drifted away, Victor guided Adrian's wheelchair toward the car. Sophia trailed behind, her heart still racing. Whispers followed them out the door, echoing down the marble steps like judgments written into the night air. Inside the car, silence reigned until Adrian broke it with a sleepy whisper. "Papa, did I do wrong?" His eyes glistened with the fragile uncertainty of a child who had dared to speak boldly in a world built to silence him. Victor's hand tightened on the steering wheel. "No, my son, you did something braver than most men in that room ever could. You spoke the truth." Adrian smiled faintly, then drifted into slumber, his head tilting against the seat. Sophia sat opposite, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. At last, she found her voice. "You didn't have to defend me. It might make things harder for you." Victor's eyes met hers in the rearview mirror. "Do you truly believe I would stand by and let them humiliate you?" "Humiliate Adrian? No, Sophia. I may have been silent for too long, but tonight I will not be silent." Her breath caught at the intensity in his gaze. It wasn't just defense, it was recognition, a shift in how he saw her, not as a servant but as someone vital to his world. The car rolled on through the quiet city streets, but inside, the storm of emotions lingered. Sophia pressed her palm gently against Adrian's small hand, whispering a silent promise to herself. No matter what trials came, she would stay. And Victor, staring out at the passing lights, realized he was no longer afraid of the whispers of society. For the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of something far stronger than fear. He felt the pull of hope, fragile but undeniable, weaving its way into the very fabric of his guarded heart. That night, long after Adrian had been tucked into bed, Victor stood by the window of his study. The city glittered beyond the glass, but his thoughts were fixed on the young woman who had turned his son's despair into laughter. He thought of her unwavering presence, her defiance against cruelty, and the warmth she brought into a household that had been cold for too long. He had defended her publicly, but deep down, he knew the greater battle was yet to come. Not with society, not with gossip, but within himself. Could he allow her presence to continue reshaping the world he had built, stone by stone, wall by wall? As the night deepened, his reflection in the glass seemed to whisper the answer. He was already changed. And the whispers of society, sharp and poisonous as they were, no longer held the power to undo him. The fallout began the morning after the gala. Newspapers splashed Victor's photograph on the front page, standing tall, his hand protectively on Adrian's wheelchair, Sophia just behind them. The headlines were merciless. They called her the maid who stole the spotlight, a charity project dressed as family. In the elegant corridors of business and power, whispers By noon, Victor's secretary walked into his office with a pale face, a stack of letters, and an inbox filled with demands. Several business partners had already canceled scheduled meetings. Others threatened to withdraw their investments. His empire, once built on fear and respect, now teetered on the fragile balance of reputation. At the center of it all stood Sophia, the woman who had never asked for any of this. She had wanted only for Adrian to laugh again, to feel like a child instead of a shadow in a chair. And now, her very presence was being treated as a scandal. Victor sat behind his massive mahogany desk, staring at the numbers, the warnings, the headlines. For years, he had built everything with precision. Every contract, every acquisition, every deal meant to fortify the Blackwood legacy. And yet, as the voices of outrage filled his world, he found his thoughts drifting elsewhere. He thought of Adrian squealing with laughter as Sophia wheeled him down the hallway like a race car. He thought of the boys' whispered words at the gala, calling Sophia's family. He thought of the light he hadn't seen in his son's eyes since the accident, a light Sophia had somehow rekindled. For the first time in years, Victor felt the weight of choice pressing against his chest like a stone. Later that evening, he found Sophia in the garden, tending to the roses. Her hands were dirt-stained, her hair loose from its usual braid, and yet to him she had never looked stronger. She was not the frail maid the newspapers mocked. She was the woman who had given Adrian back his childhood, the woman who had dared to stand tall despite whispers and cruelty. When she heard his footsteps, Sophia straightened, brushing soil from her palms. Her eyes searched his face, as if bracing for judgment, perhaps even dismissal. "Shouldn't be here," she whispered softly, as though the roses themselves could betray them. "Every glance, every rumor, they'll twist it against you, against Adrian." Victor's jaw tightened. "Let them. I'm done living in the shadow of their approval." Her eyes widened. "You can't mean that. You've built an empire on their respect." He stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking until she could feel the gravity of his words. "An empire means nothing if my son feels like a burden. If the woman who saved him is treated as less than human. Without you, Sophia, all the wealth in the world is ash in my hands." Her breath caught. For years she had endured whispers of unworthiness, the cruel divide of status, but never had she expected Victor, cold, untouchable Victor, to say these words. Tears welled in her eyes, though she tried to hide them. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "I will never fit into your world. I'm not polished or educated in the ways. I don't know how to smile at their banquets or pretend I belong among crystal chandeliers. One wrong glance from me could bring shame to Adrian. To you?" Victor's expression softened. He at once believed the same, that safe pieces and power dictated belonging. But as he looked at her, he realized how wrong he had been. Before he could speak, a small voice broke the silence. "You already belong." They turned to see Adrian in his chair, wheeling himself forward with determination. His little hands gripped the rims of the wheels as if to prove he didn't need anyone's permission to speak. He reached for Sophia's hand, his eyes bright, unwavering. "You're already family. You make me laugh, you make Dad smile when he thinks I don't see. You make us whole. Isn't that what belonging means?" Sophia's knees nearly gave out. She dropped beside him, clutching his small hand as tears spilled freely down her cheeks. Victor's throat tightened at the sight. His son, the boy he had sworn to protect, yet often kept sheltered in silence, was now the one teaching him the meaning of courage. Victor knelt too, his eyes locking onto Sophia's. For once, there was no mask, no fortress of pride, only raw sincerity. "Sophia," he said, his voice low, steady, "I don't care what the world thinks. I care about Adrian. I care about you. And I care about what we could be together. So I'm asking." He reached into his jacket pocket, not for a diamond, not for grandeur, but for a simple band of silver that had once belonged to his late wife. He had kept it locked away, for years, unable to let go. But now, he understood it was not a relic of the past, but a symbol of continuing love. He held it out to her. "Will you stay with us? Not as staff, not as a shadow, but as part of our family. Will you be Adrian's mother in truth, and my partner in life?" Sophia's lips parted, a sob escaping before she could form words. Her heart hammered in her chest, fear and love clashing violently inside her. She looked at Adrian, who nodded eagerly, his smile wide enough to light the dusk. And in that moment, the walls Sophia had built around her heart crumbled. Her hands shook as she reached for the ring. It was not extravagant, not polished with diamonds or status, but it glimmered with something rarer, sincerity. "Victor," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I don't know if I'm strong enough to face their world." He placed the ring gently in her palm, curling her fingers over it. "Then, let me be strong for us. Let Adrian's laughter be stronger than their whispers. Let the truth we live outshine the lies they speak." Adrian squeezed her hand tightly. "Please say yes. I don't want just a maid or just a dad. I want us, all three of us, together." The boy's plea pierced her deepest fear. She had endured loneliness for so long, convincing herself she was destined to serve rather than to belong. Yet here was this child, choosing her, pulling her into a place she had thought forever closed. Tears streamed down her face as she finally nodded. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling but sure. "Yes, I will stay. I will fight the whispers. I will love you both, no matter what comes." Adrian let out a joyful cheer, clapping his hands, his laughter echoing like music against the garden walls. Victor closed his eyes briefly, as if silently thanking fate for granting him this chance. When he opened them, his gaze burned with fierce determination. "Is it the end of the storm?" he said, standing tall once more. "Business partners will walk away, the papers will shred us, but I won't let them dictate my son's life or my heart. They will see that I chose love, and they will respect it, or they will lose me entirely." For the first time, Sophia saw not just the ruthless CEO the world feared, but a man willing to risk everything for something greater than power. The following week was a whirlwind. Invitations to society events dried up. A longtime partner withdrew from a multi-million-dollar project, citing conflicts of image. Shareholders whispered about scandal, questioning whether Victor had lost his edge. But through it all, Victor never faltered. He held meetings with renewed fire, daring any man to challenge his authority. When whispers rose, he drowned them with undeniable proof of his leadership. Yet when he returned home, his armor slipped away, and in the quiet presence of Sophia and Adrian, he allowed warmth to soften his edges. One night, after a particularly brutal day, Victor entered Adrian's room to find Sophia reading him a story. Adrian's head rested against her arm, his eyelids heavy with sleep. Victor stood in the doorway, watching, his heart swelling at the sight. When Sophia looked up, she offered him a tired but genuine smile. And in that simple expression, Victor knew he had already won more than any empire could give him. The decision had cost him allies, yes, but it had given him family. Days turned to weeks, and though the storm raged outside their gates, inside the mansion bloomed a peace none of them had known before. Sophia no longer flinched at the whispers, though they stung. Adrian, emboldened by her love, began to try harder in his exercises, showing sparks of strength that even the doctors had doubted. And Victor, once a man defined by cold ambition, discovered a new kind of power, the power to love without fear, the power to stand beside her Sophia, not above her. One evening, as rain pattered against the windows, Sophia sat by the fire, the silver band glinting softly on her finger. Victor approached, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "They'll never stop talking, will they?" she murmured. He shook his head, his lips curving into a faint smile. "No, but let them. Their words will fade. What we build here, what we are, will last." She turned to face him, eyes shimmering with quiet strength. "Then let's build something they can never tear down." And as he kissed her forehead, with Adrian's laughter echoing faintly down the hall, Victor knew he had already risked everything. But in return, he had gained everything too. The seasons had turned, and with them, so had the life inside the Blackwood estate. What once stood as a fortress of silence and loneliness now carried a pulse, a rhythm of warmth that echoed through the halls and spilled into the gardens. It was in the garden, on a late spring morning, that laughter broke the calm in bursts of joy. Adrian's laughed, his wheelchair rolled smoothly across the path, guided by his own determined hands as he chased butterflies that danced just out of reach. Sophia walked beside him, her hands ready to steady the chair if he faltered, though Adrian hardly needed it anymore. Her presence had become his courage. Every small victory, every push forward, was born of her encouragement. Her smile followed him wherever he went, a quiet blessing that gave him strength. Behind them, Victor walked slower, his gaze caught between wonder and pride. For years, he had seen only shadows in his son's eyes, the weight of an illness that stole childhood and laughter alike. But now he saw a boy with fire in his spirit, and he knew whose light had ignited it. Sophia. Adrian stopped suddenly, his chest rising and falling as he tilted his face toward the sky. A butterfly brushed past his hair, and he pointed, grinning. "Did you see, Sophia? It landed right there." His voice rang out, bright as bells. "I saw," she said, her laughter soft but full of love. She crouched beside him, her hand brushing his shoulder. "One day, you'll catch one yourself." Victor's throat tightened at the sight. For so long, the garden had been nothing but carefully trimmed hedges and flowers kept alive by staff. Now it breathed, alive in a way it had never been, because his son had found freedom and because Sophia had brought light where there had only been duty. Victor reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the small velvet box he had carried for weeks. He had planned and postponed, waiting for the right moment, waiting until courage outweighed fear. And now, under the golden sun, with laughter weaving through the air, he knew. The moment had arrived. He moved forward, the weight of his decision grounding him. He had faced boardrooms filled with ruthless men, had signed contracts worth billions without hesitation. Yet here, as he approached Sophia, his heart beat like that of a young man on the edge of everything that mattered. "Sophia," he said, his voice lower, steadier than he felt. She looked up, startled by the sudden seriousness in his tone. Adrian, sensing something, wheeled closer, his wide eyes darting between them. Victor dropped to one knee, the grass bending beneath him. In his hand, the velvet box opened, catching the sunlight. But his eyes were not on the ring. They were on Adrian and Sophia, the two souls who had reshaped his world. Sophia's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes shimmering with disbelief. "Victor?" He drew in a breath, every word chosen with the weight of truth. "This ring isn't just about us, Sophia. It's about everything you've given me, what you've given Adrian. I lived in a mansion filled with riches, but it was empty. You gave it a heartbeat again." Adrian's small fingers gripped Sophia's, his chair pulling closer until he was between them. His voice quivered but carried a strength far beyond his years. "Dad, are you asking her to stay? To be with us forever?" Victor's eyes softened. "Yes, Adrian, but not just me asking. This has to be your choice too. Family is not something I can build alone." He turned fully toward his son. "So, Adrian, would you accept Sophia as your mother?" For a moment, silence filled the garden, broken only by the faint hum of bees and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Adrian's lips trembled as tears welled in his eyes. Then, with a voice thick with emotion, he whispered, "Yes, Mom." The single word carried years of longing, a dream finally spoken aloud. Sophia broke then, her tears falling as she pulled Adrian close, pressing her forehead to his. "Oh, my sweet boy," she whispered, her voice cracking, "you don't know how much this means to me." Victor's hands shook as he held out the ring. "Sophia, I am not asking you to step into wealth or titles. I am asking you to step into a family, to stand beside me, beside Adrian, not as staff, not as outsider, but as the woman we both cannot imagine our lives without." Sophia's gaze lifted, meeting his. She saw no grandeur, no power, play, only a man stripped of his armor, bearing his heart with a vulnerability that matched her own. And with her voice breaking, she said, "Yes, Victor, 1,000 times yes." Victor slid the ring onto her finger, his own vision blurring as he did. The garden, once silent, now carried a chorus. The three of them embraced under the golden sunlight, their silhouettes framed by the tall hedges and the blossoms that seemed to lean toward them as if nature itself bore witness. The Blackwood mansion, once a house of echoes and whispers, now pulsed with life. Within its walls, secrets had been shattered, wounds had been healed, and love had taken root in the unlikeliest of soil. Geralt pressed his lips to Sophia's hair, his arm around both her and Adrian. "This," he whispered, "is worth more than every empire I've ever built. This is the only legacy I want to leave." And in that moment, with sunlight painting them gold, the story of a billionaire, a maid, and a boy was no longer one of status and distance. It was the story of a family, reborn in love.